Hello and welcome to the Fresh Air Sci-Fi Show. I'm Joe and that's Dave, and he's currently having a couple of technical difficulties right at the start, which is how we start every stream. I can't hear you though, Dave. You're cutting in and out.
Can you
Yes,
hear me?
you're there.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Excellent.
That was weird. I plugged in the microphone and everything just went mute. Unplugged it, plugged it back in, and fine. Yeah.
Bloody typical, eh? It's always good. I think actually there isn't. I think it's our thing. We start every stream with something going wrong. I think if it ever goes without a hitch, we'll probably end up having a really bad stream, because I tend to enjoy every single stream, and so far, every time at the beginning, something has not quite worked how we intended it to.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go with it going slightly wrong being a good thing. So just to say it again, hello, welcome to the Fresh Air Sci-Fi Show. I'm Joe.
And I'm Dave, finally.
And everything seems to be streaming properly, which is absolutely fantastic. So, yeah, how have you been, Dave? I haven't really chatted to you in a couple of days.
Not too bad. Been busy with tutorials and study and stuff like that.
Is that going well?
Yeah. I've had 2 a day for the last few days, plus all the studying in between, so I've just been a bit shattered.
Fair.
But yeah, it's going pretty well, thanks.
Yeah. Are you enjoying the course in its entirety, or is there anything that you're thinking, ugh, this one again?
No, I'm enjoying it. There's the odd bit of stuff with the Cisco where I'm just not quite happy with the presentation and stuff, but it's a really good course overall.
You did mention occasionally their spelling and grammar's worse than mine, and I'm dyslexic. Yeah. Hi, Pine Martin. Nice to see you. So, yeah, tonight's show, we are continuing our journey into why we are atheists. So, typically last week we ended up having some technical difficulties, and the video cut out after half hour, yet it thought it was still connected, so we didn't get a disconnection message, and Dave and I carried on chatting for another half an hour before we realised we weren't even on air anymore. And I have to say, it was one of the best conversations we'd had about it in ages, because Dave and I tend to try and stay away from the conversation, theological conversations and things like that. So when we get into it, it's almost like it's a bit of a new topic, at least between the two of us. And it's interesting finding like our different routes with it. And we were discussing loads of different bits. I mean, I can say that we thought it was a really great conversation, but there is no way anyone will ever know any differently. Hey, Greg, nice to see you as well. I can see the Facebook comments, but if I respond to you in the chat, they don't go back to the Facebook comments, but they still come through, and they still appear right down there. I'm pointing on that screen because that's where I can see the cameras, but they're down there. So yeah. Restream bot, yes. So basically, I multi-stream to a number of different platforms, mainly. I've forgotten what they all are. Twitch, Facebook, and YouTube. But we can actually stream to up to 30 of them. But we're sticking to those now. And basically, it pulls in all the comments that way. Hi, Manny. Nice to see you too. Yes, we did just start. We haven't actually got into the topic yet. We're just having a general chat and talking about how last week's show ended up being Dave and I chatting for 30 minutes in dead air because we didn't realise the stream had disconnected. So you haven't missed anything yet, and I am going to be doing my best to keep my eye on the data sending, because it seems that sometimes the data just stops sending, but it doesn't tell me it's disconnected. I had a funny one yesterday, though, Dave, before we get onto the topic, sorry.
Yeah.
There was a guy talking about the way he discusses atheism online. And he's quite aggressive. He uses it as an outlet. And I was saying that, I think there are better ways to do it. And then I made a general comment about how some of us atheists don't understand things like the burden of proof, and our entire argument is based on dropping a meme and walking off like we've won something, and that we're generally not very open-minded. And he got really defensive over the comment and dropped a meme and stormed off.
That's about right.
I was just, oh, really?
Just to prove how not like those things you mentioned I am, I'm going to do all those very things.
I mean, don't get me wrong. We can all demonstrate negative behaviours from time to time, especially if someone's really irking us. We lose it. I think I'm starting to lose it more and more with certain people online than I used to, especially when it's the same shit that you keep hearing over and over. And I'm trying to pull myself back from those sorts of conversations and just go, okay, then, if that's what you think, okay. But there are still times I get fully drawn into that conversation, and it gets progressively worse. No matter how I intend it to go, people sometimes jump on things. And I think one of the problems with a text-based conversation is people sometimes read it the way they think you're saying it, not the way you intend it to be. And, sometimes I get accused of being condescending, and you know what? Sometimes I am. But when I'm not, I say, I'm really sorry I came across that way. I was trying to just convey this particular thing. And they go, "Boo," and they still don't accept it. So it's that they've almost, I suppose, they poisoned the well in a way. They've gone, well, you're being condescending, so I'm not going to listen to you. Oh, I apologise. I didn't mean to be condescending in this situation. I was just trying to convey this idea. Well, you think this. I really don't. I'm just trying to say that I don't think this particular behaviour is a good one. And that was one I was also addressing. When people say, I don't belittle the believer, I belittle the belief. And I was like, yes, but the belief is actually tied into someone's ego. It's quite often that we'll find this thing upsetting people when you do attack the belief, because the belief is part of their identity. So I know you think you're attacking the belief, but you have to see the way you do it has to be done in a better way. Otherwise, you will make them feel some form of harm, and you will make them get defensive or angry or anything like that. And yet I address a behaviour and they took it as a personal insult. And you're like, okay, but I'm addressing the behaviour, not the person. It's kind of like when you're addressing the belief, not the believer. It's almost like all of these things are tied into our ego, and we do take them personally, and maybe we can try and think of wording them in a better way. I even thought I was wording it in a better way. And we still ended up in this situation where you're pissed off with me for what I've said.
That's why language is terrible.
It really is, especially text-based. So, yes, sorry, let me just catch up on the chat as well. Okay, Greg, yeah, nice to see you. Hopefully you do get a chance to get back. You do not self-label as an atheist. I just don't believe any gods exist. Yeah, I mean, call yourself what you want. I'm not going to tell you what your identity is. If anyone, in my head, if you don't believe any gods exist, you're some form of non-theist, but call yourself what you want. Manny says you got to use memes wisely. You do. Ozzy's in the chat. Hey, how you doing, Ozzy? Nice to see you. Is the topic Christian justification, as in justified, made righteous by Christ, or epistemic justification? So we're talking more about why we are atheists. So our justification for not believing in any gods. There will probably be a heavier focus on Abrahamic deities, but it will be any in general. Leon, nice to see you here. We're just talking about, and Phil as well, how are you doing? So yeah, we're doing justification today for why we're atheists. So just to cover off what we did discuss last time was our stories of how we became atheist. Dave never held a belief, but obviously has looked into things because he was constantly questioned. And I grew up in Christian schools and went through this whole thing in and out of a religion, being a particular type of theist, and then jumping out of it, being a bit agnostic, going in and out, and the story of how eventually I got bored of having the same conversations and we decided to make a blog. So that's the really, hey Greg, nice to see you back, really short version of what we discussed last time. As I did mention, part one, we only recorded half an hour of it, and the second half hour of the conversation didn't stream, but there you go. So yes, essentially epistemic justification for global atheism. So what Ozzy's mentioning there is a difference between local atheism and global atheism. So when you're talking about local atheism, you're generally talking about the gods of the state. So if you're somewhere like America or even England, Italy, for example, your gods of the state at this present time are the Christian God, the Abrahamic deity. At the very least, if we were in certain parts of India, we'd be speaking maybe of the Hindu gods, or if we're speaking Pakistan, we might be talking about Islam, for example. So that's basically what we're doing. So what we need to cover off to start with, I did take a couple of notes, is very quickly, Dave, or very longly, not even a word. I think we need to cover off basically what we mean by justification. So what is justification?
It's basically the reasons that you have and can show for holding a particular position, basically.
Exactly. So, I mean, who does that actually apply to?
It depends on the context, but if you're going to go with, say, a certain belief, then the justification is mainly one for the individual in regards to they sort of owe themselves a duty to be rational, at least if they want to call themselves rational. So the justification is to meet that duty.
And would you say that applies to any position?
It depends, but yeah, like propositional attitudes, yeah.
And obviously, that general justification is more to ourselves than to anyone else.
Yeah, except if you're making an outright claim, like you're making an actual existential claim, then you sort of have a duty to justify it externally to other people as well, at least if you want to convince them.
So you'd separate there someone making an actual claim that something is true versus, well, yeah, I believe it's true, or no, I don't believe that is true.
Yeah, and even not believing something requires a form of justification. At least if you want to say that it's rational, you have to show that it's rational. But so not believing somebody is, it's taking a position on what they've just described to you. So if you're going to say that that position is false or that there's insufficient evidence, you must be able to justify that sort of thing.
Yeah, and as you said, that general justification is more for yourself. You've just frozen, so whilst you're frozen, I'm going to catch up with the chat. Greg says, I actually wrote down my justifications. It was based on something J. Ash Bowie posted several years ago. Should I post it here? I'm happy to read your justifications. That sounds pretty cool. LB, nice to see you in the chat as well. Good to have you here. So yes, you were talking about the justifications to make your position rational. We don't necessarily owe them to anyone else unless we're making a claim, or perhaps we're in a formal debate, or we are in court. So we don't necessarily have to justify our position to anyone else unless we are asserting, no, it's definitely true, sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, a general conversation as well, in just like a general everyday dialogue. If you're having a two-way discussion with something and you say something about their position, you might not have a duty to say it, but it would be more polite to actually give your justifications in those kind of situations as well.
Yeah, exactly. But we wouldn't necessarily apply it to every single thing someone says. So if I was to say, what did you do at the weekend? And you were to go, oh, I went down the beach. I wouldn't go, prove it.
No.
I mean, it's ridiculous. In general conversation, you could justify it. You might even have a picture. You might have a GPS tag. But in general conversation, you wouldn't necessarily justify it. But you could easily justify it to yourself anyway, because you know what you did at the weekend.
Yeah.
And you probably went with Emma, and she knows what you did. And, yeah.
Yeah. It's sort of going back to your thing, do other things need justification? Think of something like that, but like you step outside and it's raining and you feel the rain. You can justify the idea that it's raining just from being there. You don't necessarily have justifications beyond that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, that's something sensory. So I suppose this comes on to we've just covered off some of the general misunderstandings about the burden of proof in that regard, is that some people say anytime someone holds a belief, they have a burden to prove it to someone else.
Yeah, no, that's definitely not the case. If you want to tell somebody else that they should believe that too, then you've got to kind of justify it.
Yeah, definitely. So if you're in a conversation where you might have some between a theist and an atheist, for example, whatever definition of atheist they're using, the theist is saying, no, it's definitely true, or you should believe this because otherwise you'll go to hell. They have obviously that burden, but the atheist in the same regard go, well, I don't believe you. They still have a justification to say, well, these are my reasons why I don't accept what you are saying. It's not simply no evidence, not enough evidence, I don't accept it, it's bullshit. There is a little bit more involved in them justifying why they don't believe or actively disbelieve in the position. Obviously, I don't want to get into another conversation right now about the definition of atheism. That one goes on far too long, and we've got a couple of videos about that anyway, so we can skirt around that. Cool. So what other common misunderstandings do you think you've seen from the burden of proof or anything like that?
Well, one of them kind of comes from the theist side, like specific to this discussion, where they say, in order to believe that there is not a God, you have to be able to prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that there is no God. And I don't think that's an actual burden that comes from saying you believe there is no God.
No, definitely not. I don't that. Yeah, again, I think that's one of the problems with burden of proof, though, isn't it? Because the word proof is in there, they think that all of a sudden you absolutely have to prove your position. Yet, I suppose in a way that's kind of special pleading because they can't absolutely prove their position either.
Yeah. And a lot of the times you'll get people say, well, you have to prove this. And this comes from atheists. You have to prove this. You've made this claim. But then they'll make counterclaims, which they will then say, well, I'm not the one making the positive claim, so therefore I don't have a burden of proof.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of another misunderstanding of the burden of proof.
Yeah.
Because if you've made a counterclaim, you've still made a claim, and you have to show the justification for that claim.
Yeah. I mean, even if it's, well, I think the Bible's full of errors. You know, okay, so show how they're full of errors then, because that you've suddenly made a claim there. And realistically, it's probably quite easy to find. I've found a number in my time.
Yeah.
Just to catch up on the chat, yes, Greg, even though it doesn't fully come through to the chat window, I can see it in my personal chat window, so I will read out your burden of proof for disbelieving God exists when we come to that bit as well. So yeah, that's not a problem, so don't worry, it's not limited. Yeah, LB's talking about the hide the ball argument. It's good. Yeah, a few people, Ozzy, have been watching that video that you did with us recently, and everyone loves you. You got a load of new fans. Yeah. Phil brings up another one. Negative claims don't have a burden.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it has become this meme that exists within the skeptic and atheist community that it is only positive claims that.
Oh, we've lost you again there. But yes, you're right. There is that meme that's gone on where it's only positive claims that get this, and it's a shame, really, because when you understand that justification is simply just providing your reasoning for your holding your position, at least in general, unless you're saying something, no, this definitely is true, then realistically, is it that hard? I mean, we're going to show you how we do it, and you can tell us if you think that's enough of a justification. Now, one thing we did say that we were going to do last week was that we were going to address the two types of atheists. So we're not going to get involved in the debate about the definition of atheism. What we are going to do is address, you have your lack of belief atheists and you have your belief gods do not exist atheists. So Dave and I are both belief gods do not exist atheists, but did you want to take away this one on how, if you were just a lack of belief atheist, you would address the position?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd go with just a lack of belief. I'd go with the does not believe God exists sort of Anthony Flew idea, rather than just describe the psychological state. You describe a psychological state, but by taking a position on the actual kind of proposition itself.
Yeah, and I'd agree with you on that. I think a lot of, so again, even when you think about a lacktheist, if you want to call them that, they describe that in different ways themselves. So some of them will only lack belief, or some will say, no, I don't believe, and they will admit it's an answer. So as you said, if you want to take away one that, like Flu's work, I don't believe in gods, or I don't believe gods exist.
Yeah, I'd go more for something like that. And one of Flu's things is that it's separated from agnosticism, because to use agnosticism is to say that the agnostic thinks that the claim in the proposition is still something worthy of consideration, whereas Flu's idea was that the atheist who does not believe God exists isn't allowing for that. They're saying that they've considered it, but they consider it false. They just don't believe it, kind of thing.
Right.
And there is good sort of thinking that can come from that, in that it kind of goes back to the whole sufficient justification for belief.
Oh, we lost you again. We've lost you a few times recently tonight, Dave. I thought we were gonna manage to skip past this today.
And it would be a better.
Yeah, you're back.
I've just cut out for a while, haven't I?
You did. I don't know why it's happening again. It seems to come and go, doesn't it? I do apologize.
Usually, as soon as we start streaming.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true, actually. When it stopped streaming the other day, it was perfect for ages. I think maybe it could be a case of, as I mentioned before, my computer's getting on a bit. I will be buying a new one once I've sold the house, and we'll see if that can that handles it a bit better. Maybe there's just too much going on for it. I mean, it doesn't look like it is. I'm barely using any RAM and only 14% of my processor, so it shouldn't be, but who knows. We might also try not using Discord and try using the Google Meet and see if that works any better as well. So anyway, I do apologize for the cutting out. So you just jumped into the flu, saying that it's a more active don't believe than only lacking belief.
Yeah, in that it's actually taking a position. But unlike the agnosticism, where they're saying that they've considered it and they haven't made up their mind, the blue sort of atheist, they've considered it and they've made up their mind in that they don't believe it. They don't believe God exists, but they don't hold the idea that God does not exist. Sort of. It seems like a silly distinction, but it's there. And it sort of comes from the principle that we should withhold belief based on, insufficient evidence, unless we're convinced. I know it seems a bit of a tautology, because what convinces us is what convinces us. So it is slightly different, but it still uses that epistemic principle that we should withhold belief until given sufficient justification and reason.
Yeah, it does seem a bit like epistemic agnosticism.
Yeah. And I hear theists using this.
Mm-hmm.
And they're saying, well, I'm just withholding belief until such and such a time. They could go with flus and they would have a similar sort of justification to give, and they could then give that justification in an argument to convince other believers, start a conversation about sufficient evidence, about sufficient justification. And they could say, this is why I do not believe. Whereas
Yeah, whereas is where you've ended up again. Let's quickly catch up with the chat whilst Dave is frozen again. I do apologise. Leon, thank you for telling Philip about the stream. Most appreciated. Yeah, I am going to keep my eye on both the chat and the everything like that, Leon. Yes. You're back.
Yeah, I'm going to try quitting out and coming back in.
Okay.
Just to see if that helps with anything.
Yeah, cool. Hopefully it does. So whilst he's going on, LB says, ask Ozzy, as an atheist philosopher, what do you get tired of hearing atheist activists all the time? Yeah, it depends on which activist. You're right there. I mean, Ozzy, for a question from us whilst we wait for Dave, is there a particular activist that you especially like and an activist you especially dislike, and why? LB, be careful. The restream bot doesn't like all caps. Just for your advice, it will eventually punt you out if you keep doing that. The Maverick says, "Why would you withhold belief if said belief benefits you and has not been proven false?" So, I mean, what end are you going on there? Why would you hold the belief the proposition is true, or why would you hold the belief the proposition is false? there's I would think that depending on what's convinced you is where you would be, and if you're unconvinced, that's why you would withhold belief, one way or the other. Ozzy says he gets weary hearing people parroting horrible counter apologetics quite uncritically and constant burden shifting, all while they boast how they're such great free thinkers and critical thinkers. Yeah, that's a very, very, very common one that frustrates me as well. Definitely. You're back in the room, Dave.
Yeah. Not sure for how long, though.
Now I've got to try and remember where you were.
Yeah, I know. It's not that. But basically, the idea was that theists could use this idea to actually branch out and give their version of the burden of proof or the burden of justification by arguing that they take a particular epistemic principle, which is the withholding of belief, and then they could use that to springboard into an argument to try to convince the believer why they should hold that epistemic principle. So there is an argument that can be sprungboard too for the sort of weak atheism idea from that, rather than from the lack of belief thing, which is just burden of proof isn't on me. I just lack belief. I don't have to counter your nonsense arguments, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so again, I suppose it depends on why people are having these discussions. If the Lactheist is actually out there to have an honest conversation, that should be what they are trying to do, rather than sort of just going.
Yeah.
Sorry, carry on.
Oh no, I was just agreeing. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just. It keeps cutting out, and I'm losing rhythm and kind of everything. Yeah.
Typical, absolutely typical. Ozzy also says an atheist activist I would recommend would be Dr. Stephen Law. I would definitely agree with that one. I remember you introduced me to him probably only a year ago, and I bought his book for my son, and I really enjoyed the book. And yeah, he's great. I love reading his articles, the way he writes and explains things. He can make topics that are quite dry seem really, really interesting. He's got a good knack for that. Aaron Rana's ilk are an embarrassment to the atheist and critical thinking movement. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Anyway, so using say Flu's negative atheism position, I think that's what he called it, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But
you can call it weak atheism, negative atheism. It's the same thing.
What would you say the best couple of justifications for holding that position would be?
The epistemic, sort of epistemic justification, where you're withholding thing, I think that's probably one of the best ones for it. It works equally well for agnosticism, and I suppose it just depends on what label you want to be called by and by what definition. But it is a pretty good reason for not believing God, in that you haven't been presented with enough sufficient justification.
Yeah, I mean, that works for me. I don't know. I think you and I both feel that we have had enough justification to actively disbelieve, though.
Yeah. And to be honest, I think most atheists, even the Lactheists, do. They just, for some reason, they're afraid to dip the toe in the water, afraid to go against these main kind of thinking that goes on within the group, where it must only be this and you must respond with it's not my burden of proof, all those kind of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that comes down to hearing a lot of misinformation that, holding an active belief means you have a burden of proof. And therefore, if you have a burden of proof, they think, again, the misunderstanding of you have to prove it true. So they say, I mean, there was even that atheist I quoted on, I think it was on the article I wrote called "Do We Atheists Have Burden of Proof?", where she actually admitted that I would never say I believe gods don't exist, even though I don't, because a belief is a claim, and that means I have the burden of proof.
Yeah, all sorts of good convoluted arguments.
Yeah.
I mean, going back to speaking about critical thinking, a lot of these people do call themselves critical thinkers. And as critical thinkers, you would think they would be happy to take on that justification for showing their belief, because that's part of what critical thinking is.
Yeah, again, that comes down to a misunderstanding of critical thinking and just being critical instead. And a misunderstanding of skepticism and just doubting or being a denialist or a cynic. But yeah, that's one of those things. Ozzy's got to go for supper. Yeah, cool,
Oh,
dude.
nightmare.
Thank you
Take care,
for
Rossi.
joining in. Hopefully you can join us later, but it's not going to be a long stream tonight. I think Dave and I are both completely shattered.
Yeah, and all the freezes are just they're stopping me from getting into a rhythm and a flow with the conversation.
Hopefully, though, we can make it through to the end.
Aye.
So just catching up on everything like that. Yeah, Ozzy actually said so. It was questioned earlier by LB about Matt Dillahunty. Ozzy's actually friends with Matt, and there was a good conversation that when I've been getting time, I've been dipping in and out to it, where Ozzy actually changed Matt's mind on something. So that was interesting, and hopefully he can continue that process and continue to change his mind about a few things. But as Ozzy says, regrettably, unfortunately, Matt's call-in show does not show him in a favourable light. He's better in formal debates. That may be true. I've not actually seen Matt in a formal debate. I can imagine he is the sort of person that would be good at holding his own in it, especially because he doesn't have the ability to just slam down the phone on someone he disagrees with, and he actually has to address their opinion. Because I think that he is actually a brighter guy than he lets on in his shows. The way he acts in the shows, I think it's the entertainment value. And I think at the beginning of the Atheist experience, I remember Andy first showed me to them when I used to work with him, and some of them were a bit funny, a little bit like, oh, but it's nothing like they are now. And now it just seems to be a hell of a lot of shouting and slamming down phones. So yeah. Yes, Phil, those books from Stephen Law as a kid, yeah, the complete philosophy files, they're the ones. Maverick says atheists do have a burden of proof, because saying no God doesn't exist is a positive claim. If a theist wanted to play games, it could be said theist lacks belief in non-existent gods. Yeah, well, this is what we're discussing tonight. So we're talking about our justifications for why we believe gods don't exist, and how someone who can be in that sort of, whatever you want to label it, the weak atheist or the agnostic or whatever, and what that burden of justification is. But obviously it is not to prove the position true. If you're holding a belief, unless you're actually saying, gods definitely exist or gods definitely don't exist, then all you've got to do is explain the reasoning for your position. So this is what we are going to do, because both Dave and I are atheists. We believe gods do not exist, and we're going to explain our position. It might be easier for, because we're going quite global, it might actually be easier if you do focus on a particular god to justify why you do or don't believe in it, whereas we're sort of being overly broad, but the broadness is also part of the justification that we will get to. Oh yeah, and Greg says that he's met and hung out with Matt twice and is a nice person in real life. I bet he is. I think a lot of it is the front for the show. I think so much of it, he's tied up into sort of that attitude. Like the conversation that I was watching with him and Ozzy, he did seem like a different person in that regard as well. That he was having a conversation with a friend rather than attacking someone's position or bending it his. So yeah, I can completely believe he's a different person in real life. But then so many people are. The internet breeds an heuristic nature out of all of us that even the best of us sometimes lose it, generally because other people are losing it in the chat and antagonizing us. But it's not the great environment to have these civil conversations. Most people are not there for a civil conversation, which is a shame. Because a few people who I have met that are up for that sort of conversation are great, even if we completely disagree. And they have a belief and I have a disbelief in their belief and whatever. We can have the conversation and go, yeah, okay, cool. Should we move on to a different topic and have a different discussion? And that's cool, man. Like, you don't need to actively attack people. You can just have a discussion about your beliefs. So, yes, we were saying that we were going to justify why we actively disbelieve in gods. So, do you want to start, Dave?
Well, there's still a bit more to go on the theism thing.
Oh, yeah. Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to jump ahead there. I got
That's
caught up
all
in
right.
the answering people in the chat. Sorry. So, yes, you want to continue with the theism?
Well, one of the things as well is going back to the critical thinking. A lot of them call themselves critical thinkers, so they should want to have these justifications. And they should want to share these justifications, especially if they, want others to not believe as well. I think one of the problems comes in is that they sort of get all these different ideas conflated together. Like, if I say I believe God does not exist to a Christian, I'm not talking about any kind of God. I'm not saying the Hindu gods don't exist. If I say to a Christian, I believe God does not exist, because you're adopting the language that they're using. So saying I believe God does not exist to a Christian is the same as saying I believe the Christian God does not exist.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of them get into a muddle in that they think that if they use those words, they have to justify every God that's ever been, ever could be, anything like that. And in a conversation online, it doesn't necessarily go that far.
Yeah. Yeah, but there is a hell of a lot of talking past each other, isn't there? Sometimes though, when you do push for an answer, they'll say, "Oh no, I actively disbelieve, or I believe that the Abrahamic deity definitely doesn't exist, but when it comes to other gods, I don't necessarily know either way. I'm not sure what my position is. I'm a bit uncertain." And you go, "Okay, cool. So can you justify why you disbelieve?" And they can. And you're like, okay, so why, when you're having a conversation with a Christian, aren't you doing that? Because at least if you can justify to them, they're going to be talking about their God. They're not talking about other gods. They already don't believe any other gods.
Yeah,
Well.
exactly.
You're in the same position with them on that bit. So just talk about the conversation you're having. Greg, thank you very much for popping in, mate. Nice to see you. I will read out your comments later, and hopefully you can tune in as well and catch us doing that and see what feedback you get from your comments. Sorry, carry on, Dave.
That's all right. And I think one of the justifications as well for theism, when it comes to sort of disbelieving in God, there's a few different things. Like, you have to disbelieve for, say, whatever personal reasons. There's a hell of a lot of apologetics out there. And while you've not been introduced to them, you shouldn't be expected to have any kind of argument against them. But as you're being introduced to them, just saying, "Oh, I don't believe it, it's ridiculous," doesn't really kind of cut it. You then have to start having justifications for not believing these things, and that adds to your justifications for believing, for having the stance that you do. So you can introduce these justifications as well. And many of them are similar justifications to those that you would use if you were to argue that you believe God does not exist.
Mm. Yeah, and I suppose actually if people spent more time actually doing this, they might find that they have a firmer disbelief in gods, or they might go, actually, I don't feel so justified in this. I need to do either a little bit more research or realize that maybe I do actually hold a belief. Maybe there's a bit of a fear that way. They feel they can't justify their position, but they don't want to believe for whatever reason. I don't know.
It's possible, especially when you add in the whole allergic to the word belief thing that seems to go on in the skeptic and atheist community.
Yeah, that is one of the things. I mean, a belief is, as I'm sure all of you who are watching this know, is just something you accept as true, or a positive attitude towards a proposition, or something you think most likely. But there is a common one in the online atheist community where it's accepting something without evidence and therefore is always irrational. Well, I can accept something without evidence and it be rational because it's about my reasoning that goes into it. So it's already wrong, and that's not the only way you can describe a belief. So it's sort of wrong on both ends there. And they do the same with the word faith, because ultimately faith is another one of those words which just means trust. But because of the attachment to religious faith, they will just reject that as well. And it's like, yes, I understand you don't like religion or whatever, but you don't have to apply your bias to the general language that we use. But then I suppose it's only human.
Yeah. Not believing in God doesn't mean you have to remove a quarter of your vocabulary.
No, exactly.
It's like a really weird sort of Orwellian stance.
I'm atheist now, so I can't say these words.
Yeah. It's such an odd stance. And to put that much sort of meaning behind words just seems kind of odd to me. Especially simple words like that.
Yeah, definitely. As Manny says, they play hot potato with belief. That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
So just before we move on, Maverick says, I define God as follows: impersonal, like universal laws; timeless, like a photon; eternal, like energy; formless, like EM waves; divine consciousness. Fair. I mean, that's as good as any, although it's not really the way most people would describe a god. It seems almost like a pantheist sort of view of a deity. So God as described by Hermeticism and Sikhism. Okay, do you know what? There are a couple of religions I don't really know that much about, so maybe that's something for me to go away and have a look at and see what you mean in a bit more detail for another stream. So, was there any more that you wanted to cover off from a lack of belief standpoint?
No, just that they should sit down and think about their positions and realize that to be critical thinkers, there is some level of justification that needs to go on, even for a lack of belief thing. And if they start looking into Flew and his argument, they'll actually come up with some reasonable justifications to begin with. And stop being afraid to do the whole justification thing. Stop using a lack of belief as a shield to insulate yourself from having to do any actual critical thinking.
Definitely. Especially if the only reason you're maintaining this lack of belief is because you think it absolves you of your epistemic responsibility to justify your position. Because it doesn't. And by saying that it does, it makes you look foolish. And I don't think anyone really wants to look foolish, and unless they're getting paid for it, I guess. Are you getting paid to look foolish? If you are, sign me up.
Yeah. Be a millionaire by the end of the week.
Yeah, especially with our streams. So is that about it for the lack of belief ones? Do you think that you can you address right now, or is there anything else? Yeah. So what arguments do you think convince you that there are no gods? Obviously, we have a bit of a different starting point, as I mentioned. I grew up going to a Christian school, saying the Lord's Prayer every day, singing hymns, and went to Sunday school a couple of times and didn't go again because I didn't like it. You obviously never believed, and you were sent to Sunday school by your nana or gran, and you were sent home from the first ever time that you went as a devil child.
Yeah.
And I spent some time dipping in and out of different religions, but ultimately finding them all unconvincing, to a point where eventually I ended up believing there were no gods. Whereas you've probably always been in that position.
Yeah.
So I suppose for you, it's more people going, well, why don't you believe this particular claim, rather than you exploring it in the first instance?
As a kid, yeah, it was more learning to answer why I didn't believe. And as I got older, I started looking more into the arguments. And because I was being introduced to more arguments, I had to learn more and more and more. So really, it sort of sent me off on my path towards enjoying philosophy, which is I'm pretty grateful for.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. So I suppose originally your arguments would have probably been against the Christian God, though.
Yeah, because that was the dominant god in the social structures.
So from there, what were some of the things that were originally said to you?
How do you mean?
So the original questions that, why don't you believe this? What about this? What as a kid, and obviously this is going to be probably a weaker justification than you can justify now, but what were some of the justifications you used to give to some of the critique you got for your disbelief?
It was pretty simplistic stuff, but mostly based on the problem of evil,
Mm-hmm.
divine hiddenness, but very simplistic sort of version of it. Obviously, I was like 10, um, and the existence of different religions and things like that, and how it looked like society. It was the kind of thing that society just did, was make up gods.
There you go, Philip. He said divine hiddenness. I was waiting to see if Dave brought it up himself without me throwing it in the mix, because he said it a couple of times in the chat. I wasn't ignoring you. I was just seeing if it came up.
Yeah, and I mean, I still kind of hold to those three. Like the divine hiddenness is something I still hold to. The problem of evil, but in a different sense. Generally, when people talk about problem of evil, I'll tell them it's not a particularly good argument. That's because they know only the most simplistic versions, and the theists will always have an answer to those simplistic versions. It's good justification for yourself, but arguing it with the theist is a different matter, and you've really got to know the arguments.
Okay, so I mean, why don't you take us through a couple of these arguments? You don't have to obviously take us through a 2-hour lecture for each, but just give us a basic overview.
Well, there's the logical problem of evil, which is the idea that a perfectly good God would want only good things, a perfectly just God would only want just things, and the sort of contradictory attributes leading to it not being logically possible for God to exist.
Mm-hmm.
And that generally tends to be the main one that a lot of the atheists today use. And they'll argue from the existence of certain evils. But as Plantinga argued, you can always argue that these things are being done in the name of a greater purpose. So there's always that out. You might not be able to explain why 6 million Jews had to be killed in the Holocaust. It might seem evil to you, but God has a plan, and you can't understand this plan. So it can always be written off. But then you have the evidential problem of evil, which is evil in the existence of like horrendous evil, horrendous suffering, things that you wouldn't necessarily be able to write off that easily, like animal suffering or the worms that burrow into a child's eyes so that they can be born. There doesn't seem to be any specific thing that we can learn from something like this. And it counts as evidence against God's existence.
Mm-hmm.
Unless it's an evil God.
That one actually came up with Philip in a conversation with someone. I think it was yesterday, wasn't it, Philip? We briefly skimmed around that particular one, but yeah, that it makes a lot of sense. Then you mentioned define hiddenness. Did you want to take us through that one briefly?
It's basically the idea that God can't reveal himself or God is hidden. The universe appears to be a universe without a God. Divine hiddenness is just the idea that God keeps himself hidden purposefully. And, what's the difference? If God is keeping himself purposefully hidden from me, then he doesn't want me to love him, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. So that's not necessarily an argument, perhaps, against, say, a deist God.
Well, that's still a God of divine hiddenness.
Yes. But I'm just saying, if you're talking about a personal God, it's more of an argument against personal gods.
Oh, yeah. But divine hiddenness still talks about the idea that we can't see God, manifest itself in our universe. So what's the difference between the two gods? Why should I have reason to believe that this God exists? Doesn't it seem more likely that it doesn't if we have to excuse its not appearing in reality?
Yep. Preaching to the choir, man. And you mentioned a third argument, but it's jumped out of my mind. What was that?
Oh, the argument from psychology.
Okay, and what's that one?
Where it's in our nature to create gods. If you think about the different iterations that gods have gone through, we can see sort of like in the polytheists where they're figuring out a way to control their environment. They pray to such and such a god to have the rain, such and such a god to have the harvest. They're looking for ways to control the environment. And we can see religions evolve in different places, all with similar kind of ideas behind them. It just seems to be in our nature to create these versions of gods to help us navigate our way through society and the world better.
There's actually an argument from evolutionary biology to explain this. I think I've included it in a couple of articles in the past, and it's we're prone to assign agency. So it was an evolutionary survival trait. You're out for a walk, trying to do your hunting and gathering and whatever. There's a rustle in the bush. And the people that assume that it's a lion and either prepare to fight or run away have a higher chance of surviving than those that go, probably nothing. And that sort of assigning agency to natural things sort of led to a superstition. Oh, well, we didn't bless this tree and now it's died, so the god must be mad, or some creature, some entity. And that superstition obviously then started building into these religions, and then it goes into what you're saying about controlling the environments, controlling the rains. We did this dance and the rain came, so therefore there must be a god that decides that doing this dance, I don't know why that's a dance. There you go. I think I was banging on the drums, rain drums, but apparently my drums are up here.
You're only tiny and have big drums. But yeah, that's essentially the idea, that it seems to be God is a creation of man. Of course, they all don't necessarily show that God does not exist, but I think that you add on to that something like naturalism seems to explain all of these things in a more parsimonious and in a better way than theism does as well. So it leads me to believe that it's more likely than not that God does not exist, rather than any outright claim that.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I think there are certain claims of gods as they're written that are as illogical as a square circle. But I think in general, I'm with you. I'm not going to outright and say that there's definitely no gods. Just that I believe there's no gods. I think it's unlikely that gods exist. I think another thing we could come back is, sort of naturalistic arguments and things like that, which I think that there's plenty of models that show no real need for a god to actually exist.
Exactly.
So, yeah, I think that is definitely a big one for me. I also think another one is how many different gods and God claims that there are around the world, there is an overwhelming sort of lack of consistency. They can't all be right. So, especially the ones that are saying, well, no, there's definitely only one God. So, if they can't all be right, it's probably more likely that they're all wrong. I know that's a bit of a stretch, but this is just part of a formulation of my overall argument.
Yeah.
I think that the lack of clarity in religions, the fact that you end up having them breaking off into so many different denominations, arguing over these perfect texts. I mean, if this is really a divinely inspired work, then why is it so argued over? Surely it should be able to be, oh no, this is definitely it. If we've got, especially if you're going for an all-powerful, all-knowing style God, surely it could give us a book that would not be argued over. It surely. And then you've got errors in holy books, and there are errors in the holy books. Again, surely if it's divinely inspired, there'd be stuff in there that no one could possibly know at that time, and it would be correct. But it's not. I mean, there's so many little things, be they historical errors or moral errors or whatever, or contradictions in books and things like that. I think they add to the fact that, well, there's definitely something wrong with this book. It doesn't necessarily say that this book wasn't based on telling a story about a particular deity, but I think that is one of the big ones for me that just says, oof. And also testimony, not even talking about testimony, say, within the Bible, but people's experiences that they have, their anecdotes of gods. They've got so many different contrary testimonies as well about their experience of a deity. And I do think that there's a big part of most gods come to by some form of presupposition or fallacy, well, we don't know, therefore it's got to be a god. I can't explain this thing, so therefore it's a god. Which I think, again, is tied back to how, well, we don't know why the rains come, but it seems to be when we bang the drums. And it's now, we can explain all of these different things with the different weather patterns, but it's now, well, I don't know how the Big Bang happened, so therefore God. And it moves it back. The gaps are definitely getting smaller and smaller and smaller, but there's still that, well, we don't know this thing. So therefore we're gonna shoehorn it in there. That's where it goes. That's where it goes. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I think they're probably, along with what you said, they're my main ones. One that I will say comes up to me is an overwhelming lack of credible, consistent evidence. And an overwhelming lack of coherent and consistent definitions of gods. Both of those. I'm not saying there's no evidence. I will say that the Bible and the Quran and the Vedas and all of that are evidence. They're just contrary evidence. But they are evidence because evidence is indicative, just not good evidence. So that's why I say there's an overwhelming lack of credible evidence. Just to put that one out there, because I know plenty of atheists out there will go, it's not evidence. Andy and I got in a conversation with someone in a group today. They went, well, this evidence wouldn't count in a court, so it's not evidence. So just because the evidence would be inadmissible in a court doesn't make it not evidence.
Yeah. Well, there are two kind of big ones for me as well. The evidence seems to point towards the gods in holy text to be fictional entities. The evidence seems to point towards a more physicalist sort of expression in the universe. There doesn't seem to be supernatural entities. And we've looked in places where we should have found them and not found them. And it's sort of the same with God, where we look to see evidence of God's intervening in the natural order. we can either use Hume's argument for miracles, in that we have no good reason to believe any testimony about miracles going back in the past. And in the present times, whenever they've been examined, it's been shown to be a leaky toilet or something like that. So I know it's a bit of an inductive argument, but the constant failure to provide that kind of evidence to show that God is more likely leads me to believe that God doesn't exist. I know we've got apologetic arguments. We can come to them in a bit. And the other thing is sort of the atheist stance, in that God is an incoherent concept. And the fact that all of them seem to be incoherent leads me to believe that it's just an attempt by humans to create a concept that explains things.
Yeah, that's definitely a big one for me. I think I can't remember who made the quote as well on your first point. There's never been something scientific that has then become explained by something supernatural, but it's gone the other way. There's things that have been perceived to be supernatural that have then been later explained by something completely natural. Again, I mean, all of these arguments sort of tie into each other. You could say that we're saying the same thing in different ways for some of the points, and I guess we are, but that's because all of these arguments work together to form the disbelief. That's why it's not simply just lacking belief, and that's why we don't actively believe gods exist. It's why we believe gods don't exist, and all of these arguments sort of work together.
Well, that's it. It's sort of like, if you think of something like the Kalam is the way William Lane Craig uses it. He makes a cumulative argument, in that it's argument after argument that builds up the strength of the probability. And that's basically how I see arguments for the belief God does not exist. It's not a particular knockdown argument that goes, yep, there you go. It's accumulation of all different things that all seem to work together to come to a stronger case than theism does.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if we didn't believe that, we'd be theists, probably.
Yeah. And I mean, I'll admit that there are some arguments from theism that make me go, okay, yes, that is an argument in theism's favor. It just doesn't convince me.
Yeah. I mean, there are some times when I find myself wowed when I start thinking about the planet and how it's moving through space and spinning round and going round a sun, and the sun's also sort of moving like this through space, and I sit there just going, oh, the fuck, what happens if it just stops? And oh my god, and it just keeps going and going, and it's amazing the way everything works. And I can understand being in absolute awe of the universe and thinking, wow, something's got to be controlling this. It can't just be random. But then that's just an argument from incredulity. And it's, at the end of the day, why can't it? Oh, well, it just can't. Okay, then.
Yeah. Well, I mean, here's another one in that, kind of like you just mentioned, where some Christians will look and just based on looking around, they'll go, well, it just appears that God exists to me. And that's usually taken as a reasonable justification. So for the case where it not to be special pleading, you would also then have to accept that just looking out and not seeing evidence for God is sufficient justification to believe that it is the case that there is no God.
Mm.
And that's another one of my justifications, in that the world I experience just doesn't seem to be something that I would kind of consider as being divine.
Yeah. I mean, even the concept of divinity, I find a bit incongruent. Anyway.
Yeah.
So it doesn't seem to fit what people say it is, and it doesn't seem to be particularly good.
Yeah.
So hang on, let me just have a quick look at the chat. Cool, there's loads of them in there. I do apologize for not keeping up to date with all of you. Let's have a look. Going down them. You asked a fundy relative on what he thinks to him the argument is stupid, and I'm like, you clearly said the homework done. So that's talking about the argument from divine hiddenness. In reverse Atheists. Yeah, LB says Lactheists are the product of that fundy Christian upbringing. Look at Matt, Aaron, and Paulogia, and many others. I mean, I think that is a big part of it. Why you get people who have had this serious harm done to them, felt this serious harm, felt stupid that they believe this thing, and they're trapped in a world that they can't control. I mean, I think Philip and I were having a chat with someone yesterday. It was the meme guy I was talking about earlier. And he's clearly had a bad experience and continues to have a bad experience. I think in some respects, being in England, we're quite lucky. Even though I went to Christian schools and had to say the Lord's Prayer every day and all of that, it's generally not considered a big deal. So I'm sitting here and I don't feel the same harm and aggression towards religion that some people do. The only thing I would say, though, is even though you feel harmed by it, in a way, that's your issue. And if you genuinely want to do something about the religious side of things in your culture, attacking isn't going to do anything to make it better. You'd be better off trying to have rational conversations and convincing people that at the very least they shouldn't believe, or certain parts of the Bible are clearly immoral because so on and so forth, or whatever. Philip says, the formal version of Hiddenness by John Schellenberg. P1, if God exists, there are no non-resistant non-believers. P2, there are non-resistant non-believers. Conclusion, therefore God does not exist. But that is more specific to a non-deistic God. It has to be to that loving God. Yeah, especially if it's a loving God that threatens you with hell if you don't believe. LB said, I would argue that God is not supposed to be personal. I know, but that's because you're a deist. I mean, logically supreme being like God only guides and sustains the universe, but not the earth. So yeah, I mean, I understand where you're coming from then. I think the way we've addressed some of the claim that with our arguments, that it's almost like with what you're saying there is no real difference between the deist God existing and not, because if it's all natural process or it's a hidden process, then it amounts to much the same thing. It's like I was saying, my awe of the universe and the way it works and how my mind is blown by it when I sit back and think about it. I can sit there and go, wow, that must be a God. Or I can sit there and go, but why? There's no reason to think it's a God. There's no reason to think it's not a natural process. And if you trace things back to the Big Bang and move on forward, it's lots of little small iterations that became more and more complex over time. And that seems far more logical to me than actually going, well, yeah, clearly a God did it. But I can understand why people do think that. You also say, before you forget, Andrew, right? He said, you both give good points for reasons not to accept God claims, but they aren't sufficient to claim there is no God. I would say I don't claim that there's no gods. I'd say I believe there are no gods. I would give my justifications as I just did before. So I would say that there are certain gods that I would probably claim don't exist based on how they're described, because they seem so logically inconsistent that, as I said, it's like a square circle. It just can't exist. But that doesnn't mean that it couldn't be based on something. But I think all the justifications that we've given so far are enough to believe there are no gods. They've definitely convinced us. Philip says, yeah, that whole discussion was terrible. Yeah, that was yeah, yesterday's discussion. I think that was a 3-day long discussion as well, wasn't it? We should have given up on day one. But it was one of those ones, Dave, where, you know, when people start getting it and they start agreeing and they're like, oh yeah, no, I see what you mean by this. And then all of a sudden there'd be like a break for an hour or two, and then there'd be another message in, and it'd suddenly be like all aggressive and it had gone back to the beginning again, and you'd just be like, Leon ended up getting blocked by that one.
What was the discussion?
Well, it was the meme guy, the one that I was talking about. How you know, there are certain ways that I think we shouldn't behave, and we shouldn't just drop a meme and act like we've won, and then he drops a meme and acts like he's won.
Yeah.
I can't remember actually what the whole conversation was. I think I was talking about better ways that we could address the conversation. As Leon says, I was telling the badass atheist guy that his approach was terrible for progress, but I ended up getting blocked for misrepresenting him. Yeah. I did see that happen. I mean, to be honest, with these conversations, it does get that way sometimes, and people do talk past each other. There are times when, I don't know. I mean, I did see Leon say, sorry, I didn't mean to come across that way. I wasn't trying to do that, but you said this, which led me to believe that. And it it just got too heated, and he didn't like someone saying, you shouldn't be ridiculing theists, basically, is what it came down to. Memento Mori, sorry, but people don't just feel harmed by religion, even in Western countries. They literally are. Yes, no, I understand that. There's definite harm that some people do receive. Sometimes I'm talking about different types of harm, though. There are some that feel harm just because they feel like they were stupid for believing things. And there are some that are, especially in states like Texas, where creationism is taught in schools and things like that. There's definite harm. And then when you come to other areas, I think if you go to, I don't want to be generalistic, but I can't remember where. There are some places around the world where things like homosexuals are thrown off buildings, or atheists are killed. In fact, going back to America, there are some of the anti-abortionists who, you know, bomb abortion clinics and things like that and attack the people who work there. So there is definite harm done by religion, and some people do experience it a lot worse, and I can understand why they have the attitudes that they do have, but their feeling of being harmed is what I'm addressing here. So yes, they've been harmed, and them being harmed makes them feel harmed. Their feeling of being harmed is on them. If they want to do something about the situation in a productive way, attacking religion isn't going to work. Attacking the religious people, it's just going to make them defensive and think, oh, all you atheists are dicks, and you're not going to have a good conversation. So that's what I was trying to broach there. I do apologize if I wasn't clear enough when I said that. Does that make sense to you? Do you understand what I was coming from there? Hopefully. Carrying on. So LB got muted by him. Philip, yeah, should have been a 1 reply. Yeah, you're right. So yeah, LB says, do not get me started on that. I live in Texas, and there is literally a radio station that has fundy views that I cannot stand. Yeah, and the thing is, what's the best way to actually address that fundy station? Do you think just attacking the people that work there is going to change their mind? Or do you think that there is a chance that actually you could have a nice conversation with them and they might realise, oh, this person isn't quite so bad. Maybe I'll listen to what he's saying. I'm being told by the people around me that all you guys are evil, but you actually don't seem that bad. And, oh, well, let's have a chat. And you know what? You might not change his belief, but you can plant a seed. And I think that's the only thing that we can really do. Because at the end of the day, whatever you believe, people can only really change their beliefs themselves once they've been convinced. So you can provide the information, you can show that you're a good person, that you're not a Satan worshipping baby eater or whatever. And they can then make up their mind that actually maybe some of the stuff they've been told isn't completely true. Ozzy's back. How you doing, Ozzy? Oh yeah, Manny brings up that guy as well. Bad. He was addressing Philip's logic, and the bad atheist dude decided that Philip was killing logic by using it. It was just like, it was just one of those ongoing conversations. It was absolutely ridiculous, and I do need to learn and to identify those conversations when they're not going to go anywhere. But yeah.
Those are the ones that make me avoid social media.
Yeah, I don't blame you. I wish that I had your resilience to just not be on there as much. I don't think it does me any favors. I think I get really grumpy sometimes after a day of being on Twitter and Facebook.
5 minutes for me, unless it's people I already know, like Philip and Leon and everybody else, like Manny.
Yeah, no, I like having a chat with those folks. Generally, the best conversations with them come out of DMs, though.
Yeah.
But yeah, definitely. Did we have many more to address on our personal justifications? I know I went a bit off piece there. I was just I didn't want everyone in the chat thinking that we'd forgotten about them. Because if not, I've got Greg's as well that we can read out.
Yeah, go with Greg's.
Okay, so hopefully you found both Dave and I's justifications for why we believe gods don't exist at least somewhat helpful. Again, this isn't an absolute truth claim. It's why we think gods don't exist. Okay, why we think they are unlikely. And let us know if there's anything that you'd like us to expand on in the future, or if there's anything that you don't think quite works. But remember, it's not just a single piece of an argument. It's all those little bits fit in to make the puzzle, and that's why we believe gods don't exist. Now, Greg, he kindly put his justification in earlier. He said that his burden of proof for disbelieving God exists is a logical justification for reasonable non-belief. And it's 10 criteria one can use to assert God most likely doesn't exist. So God is never seen, detected, or objectively verified. So that's basically the divine hiddenness. An adequate and meaningful definition of God is never provided. Yep. So that's, again, another one of ours that we said. It's a demonstrable null hypothesis is never presented, and it's not falsifiable. There is no phenomenon best explained by God. I mean, that's going back to what we were saying about how most supernatural claims end up being explained through natural means, whereas no natural claim ends up being explained by supernatural. God strongly resembles things that aren't real. Again, that's another one that you brought up, Dave. Did he take your notes? Or maybe he's just someone who's actually thought about his position quite well. There are plausible explanations for why the God concept originated rather than God existing. Again, that's what we were talking about with evolution and assigning agency and the argument from psychology. Nearly all arguments for the existence of God invoke an appeal to mystery or the unknown, or, as I was saying, like a God of the gaps or anything like that. He got both of our notes. The God hypothesis does not adequately explain any great mystery of the universe. I'd say it does not adequately account for. I suppose you could say it explains in the sense that if it's a supernatural being that can do anything. I get what he's saying there, though. Methodologies provided to experience God are ineffective, inconclusive, and purely subjective. Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's like I was saying about how so many different people have different experience of God's, how their testimony, and if you want to go further, it's like when some people babble in tongues, and different people see different gods, and it's usually the gods that they've been brought up with or the gods of their country, and all of a sudden they see them, and again, so those experiences are definitely inconclusive. And number 10, the absence of good reasons to believe God exists is a good reason to lack belief in God. Until one or more of these categories change, it is reasonable to put God in the list of non-existing things, right along with unicorns, telepathy, and ghosts. Yeah, I mean, I'd say that's a pretty good list, actually, Greg. Nice one. You've summarized what we said quite concisely, and it took me 2 minutes to read it, whereas it probably took us an hour to go through ours.
We had other stuff to cover.
Of course we did, But I think that's definitely a good snip for us to cut out, actually, and put up there as one of our highlights for anyone who wants a quick and easy reference. Those were Greg's reasons that he disbelieves in gods. So, yeah, nice one, Greg. Thank you for those. Getting back to any other chat messages right now. Yeah. Yeah. Philip says DMs are the only thing that preserved his sanity in the conversation. Yeah, Ozzy, sorry that you missed the justifications, although we've just done Greg's list, and we mentioned a lot of those. We expanded on it further and had a bit more of a conversation with it, but they were essentially the short version of what we discussed. I know you didn't actually catch what we said, but was there anything you would add to Greg's list yourself? Sorry, Leon has a sound argument that God doesn't exist. P1, what I say is true. P2, I say God doesn't exist. C, God doesn't exist. You're welcome.
Valid and sound.
Brilliant. I like that one. Thank you for the chuckle. So yeah, that's were there any more that you had that you wanted to cover off, Dave? Because I think I've gone through all of mine.
No, that's good. It's the basics of why I hold the position I do. I mean, there's more you could go into, like responses to apologetics and deeper dive into the actual reasons, but that's a pretty ground level explanation.
Yeah, definitely. And obviously, if anyone out there wants to leave us a comment either on YouTube or DM either one of us on Twitter or Facebook, or join our Facebook group and discuss some of these with us, we're more than happy to expand on these in the future and go into a bit more detail. As we said, with these sci-fi streams, we try and keep them kind of high level unless someone wants us to explore something in detail a little bit more, because with a lot of what we discuss, there is so much to take in and think about and go over that we could spend weeks discussing just one tiny little aspect at times. So that's why we give the overviews, and we wait to see what you want us to do. Now, someone did actually ask us a little while ago to go more in depth on critical thinking, because we did a critical thinking and skepticism, talking about it from the perspective of the modern person that says they're a critical thinker and a skeptic. And they said, well, that's not critical thinking. We weren't trying to give a tutorial on critical thinking. We were just giving an overview. So we will, at some point in future, go a little bit deeper into critical thinking, as that seems to be something that people might be interested in. Sorry, catching up on the chat again. Ozzy says Greg's list was fairly comprehensive. There are other possible objections. For instance, many atheists are philosophical naturalists. If you have a good argument for naturalism, then there's a reason for thinking gods don't exist. That's one of the things that I brought up, actually, saying there's models that show that there is no real need for gods. But Ozzy says he himself is not a philosophical naturalist. Interesting. So what are you? And LB says, are you a doctor, or should I be calling you Dr. Ramses? Cool. So Ozzy confirms that he's a global atheist, so thinks that neither the god of classical theism and deism are non-existence, however, for different reasons. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, they're quite different claims. You can sort of group them up into, like Dave and I did today, where we addressed a number of different points that not all would work for every god, for example. So when we brought up things like the problem of evil, it wouldn't necessarily address a god that isn't supposed to be a loving god. So there are things like that. So you can always find, oh, but what about? That's why you need lots of different little arguments. If you're going to actually be a global atheist, there is a lot more justification, and not all of your justification will necessarily work for every god, but you have to have enough to actually maintain that belief that gods do not exist. And I think that's why a lot of people will end up being a local atheist but a global agnostic, because there's quite a lot of things to actually think about, to actually convince you that gods do not exist. Or you could just say that they're lazy. Yeah, Ozzy, if you want to come on and have a conversation about why you're not a philosophical naturalist, that would be great. Or if you want to do it privately as well, I'd be really interested either way. Be really good to have a chat with you again, whether it's on a stream or off. I'm sure Dave would like to be involved in that chat as well.
Oh yeah, of course.
So let us know when you have time. We can sort of work around you. My work schedule is relatively flexible, so any time you're up for it, man, well up for it.
And I can always skip a tutorial.
Yeah, for Aussie, definitely.
Yeah.
Hey, I can skip dinner. I don't skip dinner for anyone. Awesome. So hopefully you found that at least somewhat informative as to why Dave and I hold the belief gods do not exist on a global scale rather than just on a local. We are happy to discuss this in the future. So if you want to address any particular points, as I said, just let us know. And yeah, we'll come back to this one in the future. We on Thursday were planning on addressing your article about changing a mind, weren't we, Dave?
Yeah.
So Dave wrote an article a few years ago now, but it's about how to change a mind. So we've explained our justifications today for why we believe gods don't exist. We're going to discuss how changing someone's opinion, not necessarily talking about God belief, but we could talk about how you could change someone's belief in gods. But it could also be change someone's belief that the best way to get to the football field is going on the M4. You know, that anyway, it's just talking about changing someone's mind and different methods to do it. It sort of ties in to our discussions about discussions that we've been having, but not exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
So just checking the chat. It seems that everyone's excited. So you'd be happy to do it offline or on a stream as you wish, perhaps middle of the week. Yeah, I mean, we tend to stream on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but any time is good for us. So I tell you what, Ozzy, maybe not tonight, but I'll send you a message tomorrow and we'll try and pin something down in the future. Be really interesting, actually. Awesome. So that's it for us tonight. We have been discussing why the hell we are atheists and our justification. You've been watching the Fresh Air Sci-Fi stream. I'm Joe.
I'm Dave.
Have yourself a good night.
Good night, everyone. Thanks for joining us.